Hey, good evening, everybody. So glad that y'all are here tonight. We're halfway through our study of these four Gospels, and so tonight we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke, and we'll be 3/4 of the way through after tonight. But I'm excited for tonight. Thank you guys for being here. If you haven't been here the last couple of weeks, we have been studying the Gospels in a little bit of a different way than we typically do. Typically, we read the Gospels story by story, section by section, and kind of take our time working through the Gospels. And what we've been doing the last couple of weeks is looking at one Gospel as a whole. And so we've covered Matthew 2 weeks ago. Last week we covered Mark. And tonight we're covering Luke. And for those who haven't been here, I have been assigning homework, which might be the worst thing that you could possibly hear if this is your first night here with us. But I hope it's been a good exercise for those of you who have been doing that. What we've been doing is I've encouraged us to sit down and read the Gospel from cover to cover. And if you can, to do it in one sitting, because it really gives you a sense of the entire story, the entire flow of what that gospel writer is trying to do, and really give you a glimpse into who they are and how they encountered Jesus, how Jesus affected their life. And so I hope it's been, for those of you who have been willing to do that, had the time to do that, I hope it's been beneficial to read the Gospels in that way. I really think it can be really helpful. Today I read through John, and let me just say for next week, if you've been in church for a while, you know this, but next week's going to be different, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're so similar, and then here comes John, and he tells the story in a completely different way. Which is really one of the reasons why I wanted to do these 4 weeks, is because each of the four gospel writers tell the story of Jesus in the way that matters to them. They tell the story because Jesus affected their life. Jesus changed their life. And so the experience that they had with him caused them to want to write down this story. And each of the four of them, even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the story in a very similar way, you still get a sense of how Matthew encountered Jesus, how Mark learned the story of Jesus and was there for parts of it, how Luke learned about this story. And then next week we'll talk about how John did too. And it's really a powerful testimony to me that our Bible, our New Testament, starts with 4 different accounts of the same person's life. It's almost as if the New Testament is giving us permission for each of us to have our own unique experience with Jesus, with a lot of the similarities and fundamentals that everybody else has too, but Jesus is going to affect you, and he's going to touch your heart in a way that's slightly different maybe than the person who's even sitting right next to you. And so I think that's an important thing for us to recognize and for us to think about. So like I said, each of the 4 weeks we've been looking at how these gospel writers have a unique take, their own story of what the gospel is, but at the same time they also have some very important similarities. And so I've shared this the last 2 weeks. I'm going to keep doing it the next 2 weeks because I think it's important for us to remember that the gospel is not just anything we want it to be, right? The gospel is something very specific about Jesus. And so I've been trying to share, I think all of the gospel writers, if we boiled it down to just a really small set of sentences, you could add more to it than just this, but just a really small set of sentences, I think there's at least 3 things that I want to make sure every week and say. And number 1 is that God came in the flesh as a man to be with us. Mark, I should have a couple of slides for these 3. So number 1, God came in the flesh as a man to be with us. All 4 of the Gospels communicate this. They all think that this is an important part of the story that we need to know. Second, they say that he died, but he was also raised back to life. So there is this miraculous element of God raising Jesus back from death. And then the third one is somehow his death and resurrection have saved us from our sin. And so the gospel is not just anything we want it to be. I think it has to include at least this, right? There's probably more that we could say about what the gospel is. And I think all 4 gospels certainly give us information and put some emphasis on these 3 sentences. But tonight we're going to be focusing on some of the different characteristics of the Gospel of Luke. So I'm curious as we get started tonight, for those who had a chance to read the Gospel of Luke, or maybe if you're just familiar with the Gospel of Luke, you didn't read it before tonight, but you've got a comment or an idea about what Luke's Gospel is all about, feel free to share what touched you as you read the Gospel. What is it about Luke's Gospel that's important to you as you read through it or as you think about Luke's Gospel? What strikes you from his Gospel? Yeah, Mike.
I like Luke because he introduces so many people, Zechariah, Elizabeth, and there's so many people you get to follow them part of the way on some and then the rest of the way on the others.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so even from the very beginning, Mike's pointing out these these couple of people that the other gospel writers don't include in the story. And all the way through the Gospel of Luke, we get to meet some new people that Matthew and Luke don't tell us about. So good. So we even get to hear for a moment how Jesus' ministry intersected with their lives and how he touched them. Good. What else? Okay. Yeah, he's very thorough. The theme for me of Luke's gospel, after having read it right behind Mark's gospel, is more. We get so much more in Luke than we get in Mark. We talked last week, Mark's the shortest of the four gospels. He's all about the action. He's fast-paced. He moves from event to event, provides very little commentary, just lays it out there and says, this is what it is, and then leaves it up to us to hopefully put the pieces together of what he's told us about Jesus to believe that he is king. And so, Luke is going to go into a lot more detail. We get a lot more stories, a little bit more commentary about the stories and what they mean. Even from Jesus himself, he'll tell us more about what he's trying to tell us by sharing information or sharing stories. Good.
Since I like to eat so much, I love how many meals
Yep.
Jesus finds himself at in Luke.
Yep. Yeah, it's almost like...
That's really a central part of the story for Luke.
Yeah. Yeah, it's table. You're almost going from this meal to that meal. Usually it's actually at a Pharisee's house a lot of times. And it's this meal that Jesus is having with at least a handful of Pharisees who are there. There's going to be some kind of controversy that they're going to be upset with him about, and they're going to talk it out. Somebody else is going to enter into the equation and do something the Pharisees think is scandalous, and Jesus is going to defend that person. And
then you've also got Jesus having meals with the disciples.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the road to Emmaus with him eating.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some really sweet connection moments.
Yeah.
Table's just so important. It's something we're losing in our fast-paced culture. There's nothing like putting your feet under the same table and eating together to build relationship.
Yeah, that's right.
Especially if it involves chips and salsa.
Okay, so there's our plug. This week, there's our plug for fellowship groups, right? If you haven't signed up for a fellowship group yet, the Gospel of Luke basically is telling you that you need to, right?
I mean, God planned things that way. He made us that way.
Yeah.
It's just true.
Yeah.
We thrive on that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Luke has a lot about the girls, about women.
Yeah.
And the theme praising God is repetitive, and he carries that over into Acts,
Mm-hmm.
where he tells a story, and the end praising God. Tells a story, praising God.
Yep.
That's really cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Partying.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Partying and praising. You didn't know that was going to be Luke's byline for his gospel. The gospel according to Luke, partying and praising. You didn't know, but maybe we should add it in. Who knows? Anything else?
Are there more healings? I didn't count, but are there more healings in Luke?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I think Luke includes more healing accounts, more parables. Like I said, coming off of reading Mark last week, it's just like this gospel feels like it's bloated with information. Like it's overflowing. You just get another healing, another parable, and you just keep reading through them. And certainly that's the case. Okay, anything else? This is your chance, because after this, you're only going to hear from me for pretty much the rest of the class. So, yeah, Doug.
I always thought it was interesting to read Luke and then read Acts, because they just flow so well together. It's like part A, part B.
Yeah. Yep. I don't currently have a schedule to read Acts. Rick led us through most of the book of Acts over like 2 years. Not in a bad way. But maybe we should add it in, right?
That reminds me of something that, I don't know, you had Randy here as problem for preaching, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Josh said he would always tell his preaching students, he would make them stand and recite this thing that says, I promise to always, if I preach Luke, also preach Acts, and if not, I will go to hell.
I think he had given that up by the time I had him.
That may not have,
Either that or I just blocked it out of my memory entirely. It's like, yeah, that's nice, but it does, yeah. Well, Craig.
A couple of things jumped out at me in thinking about Luke. Where did he get the accounts that he wrote down? And a couple of times right here at the very beginning where he says, and
Yeah, that's good. Mark, would you hit that slide with chapter 1, verse 3 on it? This is what Craig's referring to when he says at the beginning that Luke had to go and he had to find those accounts. So right off the bat, he's writing to a person named Theophilus, and he says, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So this is one of those things that Matthew, Mark, and John, we think, all have a personal connection to Jesus, or they're one step removed from somebody who had a very deep connection with Jesus. Luke is a little bit different from the other gospel writers because he's got to go find the information. We know from Acts that Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, and so Paul didn't have a personal encounter with Jesus until the road to Damascus. And so Paul wasn't there during the ministry of Jesus. And so Luke is going and searching for these accounts, for these stories about Jesus, because he wants to know. He's perhaps read a book like Matthew or Mark, and he wants to know, can I find this information out for myself? And so he's writing because he wants Theophilus to have this certainty of what he's presenting to him. These events are true. I researched them. I studied them myself. But Luke is kind of interesting from that perspective, and I think certainly it's really helpful for us to be thinking about that as well, because we're more in the category of Luke than we are Mark or Matthew or John, right? Matthew and John got to walk with Jesus. We get to hear stories that other people have told about Jesus, and so for that reason, that reading Luke is really helpful to me, because Luke had to go and investigate these things. He had to go and research them in much the same way that we do. That's what we do when we gather. We read and we study Scripture. We investigate it to try to find out the truth. Going back to our theme of Luke containing more, I wanted to mention this because there is some information in Luke that is unique to Luke's gospel. To me, this kind of falls into the category of Luke just gives us a lot more information than what we've seen in other places. Mark and Matthew both have information that's unique to their particular gospel, and Luke continues that as well. So a couple of the highlights, certainly we have the Good Samaritan story. That's unique to Luke's gospel. We have the lost chapter, Luke chapter 15, which has the 3 stories of things that are lost that get found. We also have this Jerusalem travelogue, which is a really interesting aspect of Luke's gospel. Halfway through, a little bit earlier than halfway through Luke's gospel, he mentions that from this point forward, Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. I've got a slide for this one. In chapter 9, verse 51, I believe it is. Should be the next one. Yeah, there we go. It says, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And then from this point forward in chapter 9, Luke is going to just drop these reminders and these hints in on a regular basis while they're on the road, on the way to Jerusalem. So in chapter 9, verse 51, verse 53, verse 57, chapter 10, verse 38, chapter 14, verse 25, on and on I could go through this list. He just continues to pepper in these notes. Jesus is going to Jerusalem. And so this is Luke's way of preparing us for what's going to happen in that final week of Jesus' life, preparing us for the crucifixion and the resurrection. And so that's unique to Luke's gospel as well. Rick and Beverly mentioned the eating and the feasting. Jesus is always on his way to or from a meal, it seems. Chapter 7, verse 36 is an example of this. He's eating in the home of a Pharisee there, and it happens many, many times in the gospel. One of the things that I think is really important for us, and this is one of the things I really want to focus on tonight as we discuss about this gospel, is Luke has a focus that seems very intentional to speak about and show us the character of Jesus as it relates to mercy, salvation, and forgiveness. This is the core heartbeat of Jesus for Luke. Every encounter, it feels like, that Luke has with somebody, he is looking for an opportunity to teach, show, or highlight forgiveness and mercy and justice. And so I read a commentator who had this great sentence that I wanted to share tonight. I don't think I put it on a slide. I should have. But just listen. This is a great sentence. Listen to this. He says, Luke emphasizes Jesus' compassion as he lives among the marginal members of society. Women, the less than pious, tax collectors, the poor, the sick, the oppressed, and even noble Pharisees. And I love how he ended that with these noble Pharisees, because even though they are the antagonists so many times to what Jesus is doing in all of the Gospels, they are these people who need to be shown mercy. They need to know the compassion of Jesus. And so he's constantly eating in their homes. He's constantly interacting with them because he wants them to come to understand his mercy, his forgiveness, the salvation that comes from him. I didn't put that great sentence on a slide. I put my own sentence on a slide, so that shows you how selfish I am. But this is my one-sentence summary of the gospel according to Luke, if I had to write it down. I would say the gospel according to Luke is that Jesus had compassion and forgiveness for those that we would never suspect are close to God's heart. And so those noble Pharisees, they constantly are butting heads with Jesus. God doesn't have compassion or forgiveness for them, but he does. And Beverly mentioned the women that are a part of his traveling party and supporting his ministry. Surely Jesus doesn't have compassion for them. Yes, he does. And the less than pious, he has compassion and mercy for them too. And so I think that's really an important theme throughout Luke's gospel. Let me show you 5 verses before I focus in on one passage for us tonight. So chapter 7, verse 16, it says, they were all filled with awe and praised God, going back to Beverly's point about praise. A great prophet has appeared among us, they said. God has come to help his people. God has come to help his people. Chapter 11, verse 42. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. I love this verse too, because oftentimes we try to put following the commands of God over against the love and compassion and justice of God, as if you can only follow the commands of God or you can only show love. But here, Jesus says, you should have practiced justice and love while also following my commands. And so it's not either or, it's both. So I just wanted to highlight that too. Chapter 18, verse 13 and 38 have 2 very similar statements from two different people. So chapter 18, 13 says, the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then just a couple verses later in chapter 18, verse 38, a blind beggar calls out and says, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. So you can see this request, this theme of mercy and forgiveness that's being requested of Jesus. Then towards the very end, Jesus is on the cross, chapter 23, verse 34. Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. And then the soldiers divided up his clothes by casting lots. So there's this constant theme that either Jesus is speaking to someone is speaking to Jesus, and there's this idea of forgiveness and mercy that's being brought forward by Luke. And so Luke, I think, is emphasizing this for all of his readers to remind us, just like the gospel starts in chapter 1 and 2 with Mary singing this song about God lifting up the lowly and humbling the high, Jesus is trying to remind us that this is what God is trying to do in all of our hearts. He's trying to lift us up out of the low parts of our life. He's trying to show us mercy and compassion, and he's trying to humble us in the process as well. Okay, so that brings us to our one story for the Gospel of Luke that I'm going to share with us tonight. If you had to guess, if you had to pick one story out of the Gospel of Luke to be representative of the whole Gospel, what story do you think it's going to be? Any guesses? The prodigal son. That's right. I heard it said one time that the prodigal son story, if you never read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but you just read the prodigal son story, you would know the gospel. I don't know that that's entirely true, but I think it's pretty close. And so this is a great representative story of the entire story of what God is trying to do. Of course, it's a parable, right? It's a parable about the love of God, the forgiveness of God, what God is doing for us with our salvation. And so I want us to focus in on this. If you were here a couple weeks ago, Josh covered this story, and so I want to try to cover this story in a way that's different from the way that Josh covered it. So I've got one particular thing I really want to focus in on. But even though it's probably pretty familiar to most of us, and probably some of us read it this week, I want to go ahead and reread it so it's fresh for us as we talk about it tonight. So if you've got a Bible, feel free to turn over to chapter 15. If not, the words should be on the screen. Hopefully I included all the slides correctly. So Jesus has just told 2 stories about things that are lost and then that are found, and he continues with this third story. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was out in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. And so he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" Okay, there's a lot that we could focus in on this story. I've got just one thing that I really want to focus on and mention tonight. But before I do that, I'll give you a chance. What is it about this story that captivates you? What is it about this story that speaks to you, speaks to your heart, that speaks to you about who God is? What's the line or the idea? What's the word? What stands out to you in this story?
Where he's telling him, I sinned against you, I'm not worthy, and the father's not even listening.
Mm-hmm.
All he's thinking about is his son has been found.
Yeah.
And he's in for the fat calf.
Yep.
Not even paying attention to what his
That's right. Yeah.
son is trying to say.
Yeah. The younger son, he's off in a far country, and all it takes is for him to turn around and start heading home. And the father doesn't need to hear any excuses. He's done his act of repentance. He's turned, and he's now coming back home. He's coming back to God. And so I think when the father sees him, he doesn't need to hear the excuses. He doesn't need to hear the son's plan to make this right. He's ready already. Good. What else? Randy.
For me, it illustrates the unfairness of God. God gives us mercy when we don't deserve it. And God the Father gave mercy to the unfaithful son, even though his brother had been the more faithful. He still showed mercy. And I think we all need to understand that salvation isn't earned. It's freely given.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. That's really good. Yeah, there's nothing that we could do to earn it. The son's got a plan when he comes back home. The younger son does. But it would never be enough to restore his father's wealth, to fix the relationship that he had broken. The best he could do was come back and say, I might as well be your servant. But the father has this unfair grace prepared for him in advance. Good, good. Craig?
The self-centeredness of the older brother, in verse 29, he's blinded by his own self-worth, and now the realization he thinks that
Yeah, the younger brother is physically in a far-off country, but his heart yearns to return back home. The older brother is at home, but his heart is in a far-off country. He's not in tune with the Father.
But the Father has unfavored grace on him too.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And there's a lot more of us in this room that are probably really more in the place of the older brother than we are the.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I saw a hand here, and then John too. Okay, so here.
To me, it's what God's unveiling grace He gives us every day. He extends to us, no matter what we do, how we sin. He still loves us at the
Yeah.
there. He gives us grace.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, and it's worth us spending our time reflecting on that. Right. If we ever get away from thinking about that, we need to return back to it constantly, because it's so easy to drift. If we forget to reflect on it, to remind ourselves what God has done for us, it's easy to drift and to become apathetic and not to have a heart that yearns to be just like the Father in the story, even though we're more like the older son a lot of times. John and then Ellison.
You know, this is a risky story to tell. You know, we know it comes from God, but if we didn't, would it make a difference? I have to look inward and say, maybe. I hope it wouldn't, because deep down I know it's okay. I mean, it's a good story, and it's the way to behave, and I really admire the Father for running to meet his son.
Yeah.
But I feel bad for the other son, because I understand what he's going through.
Yeah.
So it's a hard lesson.
That's right.
As well as a wonderful.
That's right. Yeah, and if we go back to the first couple of verses of chapter 15, does anybody remember who Jesus is talking to when he tells these stories? He's telling the story essentially to the older brother. It's the Pharisees, it's the religious leaders. And so, yeah, it's a dangerous story because he tells the first two stories and they're these feel-good stories, and they're like, okay, what's he getting at? And then he tells this story, and there's no question about what the point is. And so, yeah, it's a dangerous story to tell, absolutely, yeah. Ellison, then we'll come back to Rick.
So one thing that has always stuck out about this is in verse 30, he says, he doesn't even refer to him as his brother. He says, but when the son of yours.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the contempt that he has for his younger brother has always been highlighted. But then what I've noticed is that when the father speaks, he ends up saying, but this brother of yours was dead until I came.
Yeah, yeah. Mark, hit my next slide. Ellison stole my thunder. This is what I wanted to focus on. And I'm going to come back to Rick here in just a second. I'm just going to mention this. The attitude of the older brother is he can't even come to call this younger brother of his brother. He's the father's son. But the father turns it back around on that older brother and says, this brother of yours. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Go ahead, Rick.
I've never thought about this before, but this has similarities to the workers in the vineyard parable in the sense of the unfair, like
Mhm.
the unfairness of the grace of God.
Yeah.
Because that, like John was saying with the older brother in this story, it would be hard for me if I worked all day long and someone comes in the last hour and they're going to get paid the same thing.
Right. Yep.
So those stories have some parallels, but there's a question I wanted to ask you because I know you've got this figured out.
Uh-oh.
But it says when the older brother was coming to the house, he heard music and dancing. So my question to you is, were they clogging or tap dancing?
I believe this is a mistranslation. As a good Church of Christer, I know that dancing would never be supported by Scripture. Yeah, I love that idea, though. And in fact, in some ways, I think this story even takes it to the next level because the workers in the vineyard are all being paid the same amount, whereas this older son feels like he has been shorted. He feels like, you've never done anything for me, but you killed a fatted calf for this wayward son of yours who's come back. Jealousy, that's right. Well, let me focus on this idea of this son of yours and this brother of yours for just a minute.
It's important disproportionate amount of the estate.
That's true.
Even regardless of whatever else happens.
That's true. Yeah.
And so he's being treated unfairly well under Jewish inheritance law
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and custom.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to enter his mind when he hears the music and the dancing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Did the father give the son, the younger son, part of his? Or not all of it, but his part?
Yes, yeah. So the issue at stake here, and part of the reason why I think the older brother feels as jealous as he does, is it appears that the father's mercy is bringing this younger son back in, and now what is remaining of the father's inheritance and estate is now going to again be redivided amongst these two sons. So the younger son's already gotten his, he's wasted it, and now the father's bringing him back in where he's going to get another share that is cutting into that older brother's share. Okay, just for a few minutes, let me talk about this idea of the language that's used in these two phrases. My hypothesis is that I think that Luke wants us to become like the father. And this attitude that the older brother has, where he can't even acknowledge the return of his younger brother with gladness and joy and partying, shows that he is not becoming like his father. And so Luke wants his readers to understand that when we are given this image throughout his gospel of this merciful Jesus, who is constantly looking for people, whether they're on the margins or they think they're very close to the heart of God, but actually they're far from it, these all need to know the mercy of Jesus. And Luke wants his readers to become like this God, where we look for the people who are on the margins, and we look for the people who think they're close to the heart of God, but yet they aren't, and we are prepared to show them mercy in addition. Luke wants us to become like God. He wants us to learn mercy and forgiveness and justice. He wants us to begin to show those to the people around us, which is always easier said than done. It's easy to show mercy and compassion to the people that it's easy to show mercy and compassion to. It's harder to show mercy to the people like the ones who are in this story. Like when we're the older brother and we look at the younger brother and we think, how could you have turned away from the love of God in such a brash, hurtful way? And yet, those are the very people that God is calling us to begin to show love and mercy to. We live in a world today that preaches survival of the fittest. We live in a world today that preaches us versus them. We live in a world today that has winners and losers, and we don't care for participation trophies. And so it's hard for us to learn this mercy and compassion because we think that there's got to be somebody who advances and wins, somebody who takes home the gold medal. You know the statistics say that those who take home a silver medal are more unhappy than those who take home the bronze medal because they were so much closer to the gold. You know what I mean? We just had the Olympics, right? So hopefully we're making sense, I hope. It's hard for us to not view other people in this world as our enemies. I think in a lot of ways we've been conditioned to do that. Just a few minutes ago we were talking about Dak Prescott and the Cowboys and his big contract, right? Some of us may feel guilty about the amount of money that our closest professional football team is making. Some of us may feel jealous because he's making that much. Some people in other parts of the country think, how on earth could you pay Dak Prescott, who's never had any playoff success, that much money, right? Because we're taught to view people as enemies and to think that if you're taking that much, how can I get what I deserve or what I want? And so it's hard for us to learn this compassion and mercy that Jesus is showing, that the Father has in this story. There's a preacher named Will Willimon who wrote a book a couple of years ago about this idea of competition and being afraid of one another. And so he talks in this book about a couple of different ideas. The first perspective he talks about is, of course, we set ourselves up as these enemies. And so we often can be afraid of another person because they might take what we believe is ours, or they might be in competition with us. But he also talks about this other idea that I think is important to bring up tonight. And so he has this quote about people who go over the top and think, okay, well, if I'm not supposed to see the other person as an enemy, but I'm supposed to show mercy and compassion to them, then that must mean that they're perfect and they're good, and there's a problem with me. And he pushes back against that. And so he writes this, and I really love the end of this quote, so pay attention when we get closer to the end. So he says, Jesus doesn't require that we see ourselves as bad and others as good, and I'll insert, nor should we see ourselves as good and others as bad, attempting to transform the other into an innocent, perfectly benign victim in order to be received by us. We simply try to see the other as loved and cherished by God, and the other's mix of righteousness and sin, good and evil, just as we are, all embraced by the outstretched hands of Christ on the cross. In movies today, you're presented with a hero and a villain, right? And they're very simple characters from the perspective of there's not very much complexity to them. The hero is all good and the villain is all bad. Life is a lot more complicated than that. There is good and bad within all of us. And this story pushes us to see that, yes, there's righteousness within me, but there's also sin. And so when the father runs out to meet the other younger son, am I prepared to see the younger son the way God sees him? Or am I seeing him the way that the older brother sees him in this story? So the challenge for us, I think, from this story is to begin to see the other person not as that son of yours, but as that brother of mine. And that's what Luke is trying to push us to in this story. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about with this story, right? But I really want to focus on that. If we're going to understand the love and compassion of God that Luke is presenting to us all the way through the story, I think we need to also learn to have that same mercy and compassion and to begin to see that son of yours as that brother or sister of mine. Brent.
It reminded me of a passage in John chapter 21, starting verse 20. It says, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following him. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. I'm reminded that God loves us all in equal amounts, but it's expressed very individually.
Yeah.
And we can't be the judge of how God chooses to express his love for other people. We see the human side of it and say, I don't deserve it. I'm exactly. I do. I have a tendency to identify with the older brother. They're out doing, who knows what. But God chooses to express his love individually. He loves us all the same amount, and we don't know what plans he has for us. So our job as Christians doesn't change. We're to follow him regardless of how he chooses to show that love.
That's right. That's right. Beautiful point. And I almost shot you down when you said the Gospel of John. It's like, no, tonight's Luke. No, that's a beautiful point. Yeah, I love that. The experience that we have with the love of the Father is going to be different from person to person. But that mercy and that compassion and that forgiveness and that love that he has for each of us is never failing. It's there, it's present for all of us.
We want to make comparisons, and we just can't do it.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, next week, Gospel of John. So if you have the ability or the interest, I encourage you to try to read the Gospel of John before Wednesday. If you can in one sitting, and if not, just read it as you can, but want to spend some time with John next week. Look forward to that discussion. Want to celebrate tonight. Also, good news for the Scotts. If you haven't had a chance to hear the update, really good report about Dennis's surgery, no cancer spread. And so we want to celebrate with you guys. Yeah. Yes, yeah. And we'll keep praying as well, certainly too. So thank you guys for your comments, participation tonight. Denver's going to lead us in a closing prayer, and then we'll be dismissed.
Our Father who art in heaven, we thank you for all the many blessings that you've given us in this life, and thanks for the opportunity that we've had to come here and to worship you and to learn from your word. Father, we ask that you would be with us and help us to look at the people around us and with your eyes, with your grace, with your compassion, and that we would always see them as possible adopted brothers and sisters in your family. In Christ's name, amen.